So I'm Cassie Anderson. I am the associate pastor at Calvary Lutheran Church in Perham. Pastor Phil Holton was our senior pastor for almost 10 years, but he recently retired, and now Pastor Steve Dahl is our current interim pastor. So Perham, just over an hour down Highway 10. We are in a community that has lots of retired folks. Our congregation has about 1,200 baptized members. And at Calvary Lutheran Church in Perham, we have a pretty clear mission: thank God, share Jesus, help others. So everything that we do, every ministry, every conversation that we have is through that lens of thank God, share Jesus, help others. Now, there's a lot of things that makes Calvary unique. One of them is that since Perham is a prime retirement location, it means that we have a town of transplants, which means Calvary is a congregation of transplants. So I would estimate that about half of our congregation, so half of our 1,000 confirmed members, have been a part of Calvary for 10 years or less. So that makes a lot of things exciting. It means we have a lot of ideas and a lot of passions that people bring with them from the other communities of faith that they have been a part of. But it brings with it its fair share of challenges. Particularly, we wonder, how do we get to know each other? What is our story as a faith community? Who are we as Calvary Lutheran Church? So we have a woman at Calvary who's a middle school teacher. She's also the mom of 3 active boys. You can name any sort of activity, and one of her sons is in them. So Deanna gives almost 3 hours of her Wednesday each week to serve as a guide for our small group confirmation. Now, none of her sons are in her small group, yet she shows up week after week. When I asked her why she agreed to be a small group leader, she said this age is messy, and figuring out who you are is a difficult process. When a kid gets that you are there because you care and you're willing to listen to them, that's how you build relationships. So this is who we are as Calvary. And nearly 10 years ago, a group of Calvary folks saw that the financial needs within our community were great, that there were families struggling because of car repairs, heating bills, even buying groceries. And so they formed a group called Twigs, Together Winning in God's Service. We like acronyms. So countless people have been helped in both big and small ways. One Christmas, Twigs provided Christmas gifts for families, so groceries for a Christmas feast and a gift card to the local store, to Shopko. So a Twigs member, Mary, was out on an errand when she heard her name being called. Up runs a little girl with a small brown paper bag tied with a pretty ribbon. This little girl told her excitedly, "This is a gift that my grandma and I put together. We made it for our friends. Merry Christmas." Inside the bag was a piece of candy, a small ornament, and a candy cane. So this little girl's family had received one of our Twigs baskets. They received the gift card, and Mary was sure that this family used their gift card to buy gifts for others. She was a little confused, even frustrated. Why are they using their gift on friends and not on their own family as we meant it to be used? So Mary shared her frustration with her daughter, who said, "Mom, don't you see this family is always receiving? Now we as Twigs gave them the opportunity to give." So this is who we are as Calvary. Now, as I said before, Calvary has nearly 1,000 confirmed members. We have an average of 325 people in worship in a week, so we're pretty average in terms of congregations, but it also feels pretty unimpressive. But when you count and look over the last year how many leaders of worship we've had over 625 people be worship leaders. So that's 2/3 of our congregation in some sort of leadership with worship. So this is who we are. And so our council, our pastors, they wondered, does our budget tell our story? And we saw, on one hand, yes, it did. If you dig deep and look at the numbers, you can see that our budget does reflect our values. But we also saw, on the other hand, no, it didn't, because the numbers on the page just can't share the richness and depths of the stories I just told you. Using some of the language that we heard from Adam earlier, the budget with all the line-by-line item, it was satisfying for the older paradigm, but as we looked at this newer emerging paradigm, it just wouldn't tell our story. And beyond that, our Twigs ministry is not even part of our budget. Those are just extra gifts. In fact, in 2015, $202,751 were given to ministries that were not a part of our budget. So we had this predicament. How do we share the living stories that accompany the numbers on the page? How do we share the generosity that we have of off-budget gifts? And we wondered, what is God up to here at Calvary, and how does our budget support that story? So to address these questions, we created a narrative budget. You all have copies of it with you. If you received a black and white copy, I did post a link to the color copy. It's on the Facebook event. So if you go to the discussion, there's a link to our website, calvaryperham.com, where we have the visual, we call it the visual annual report. It's also called the narrative budget. So we created a narrative budget. So the narrative budget accompanied or supplemented our usual annual report, and it focused on the story of what God is up to at Calvary Lutheran Church. And we focused our stories in 4 different areas: in worship, learning, caring, and reaching out. So we got those 4 categories from a resource from the United Church of Canada, and we also looked at the narrative budget from First Lutheran Church in Alexandria, and then we went to work. So we created this 5.5-page document with 1 page to talk about worship, learning, caring, and reaching out. Then we had 1 page for a condensed and story-focused budget, and then we had half a page that was supposed to look pretty and prepare our members for the narrative budget. We decided that we would mail the narrative budget to every member of our congregation. So our narrative budget primarily does 3 things. First, it helps us to see how our giving reflects worship, learning, caring, and reaching out. So we looked at our full budget and condensed our expenses into some general categories: to personnel, programs, outreach, and facilities. And if you look at the page that has the condensed budget, you can see that. So personnel, ministries and programs, facilities. And then we had also a category for all the random stuff like internet, postage, office supplies. And then we looked at those general categories and said, what amount of time and resources are spent with worship, learning, caring, and reaching out? So we asked our pastors, our youth director, custodians, and our administrators, what % of your time is spent on worship, learning, caring, and reaching out? And then we included those percentages in the budget, as you'll see as it goes across. So there's the full total, and then it's broken down what % is worship, learning, caring, reaching out. So this also keeps us accountable with how we are using the gifts that we receive. So we held in tension, what are our values as a faith community? And then what portion of our staff's time, what portion of our programming is used on our values, worship, learning, caring, reaching out. And so we were able to see that how we spent our time, how we used our gifts, did actually reflect the values that we have as a faith community. So our narrative budget also gave us a clear way to show what our off-the-budget gifts were, and this was something that we previously had struggled to share. So how do we share the story of Twigs or of the ELCA World Hunger Giving? And along with that 1-page condensed budget, we offered a few helpful arrows to folks, since we know that this was a new way to look at a budget and to understand what we're up to as a faith community. Now, second, the narrative budget helps us to share our stories more broadly, and particularly stories that focused on worship, learning, caring, and reaching out. So our narrative budget forced the leaders of Calvary to be intentional about seeking the stories that accompany our giving. And in seeking these stories, it was revealed just how abundant the gifts we truly have are. So that story I shared about Deanna, who serves as a confirmation guide, I would have never known that story if I wouldn't have said, hey, we're creating this narrative budget. Can you tell me why you're a confirmation leader? I've often heard people bemoan, church isn't a priority for families anymore, or we can't get adults to be teachers for our Sunday school. But when we sought the stories, we saw that that's not actually true. We have more than 100 adults participate in our Sunday school program, and when you add up their hours, they're spending more than 2,000 hours collectively with our Sunday schoolers and our confirmation youth. So this isn't a story of scarcity, but it's one of abundance. Now, our narrative budget helped our leaders to not only be intentional about seeking stories, but to be intentional about sharing the story of what God is up to at Calvary. So our narrative budget was more widely read than our full annual report, though many of the stories from our narrative budget were simply pulled from the annual report. So we didn't reinvent the wheel. We used a lot of the stories that we already had. And in fact, so we printed this document last fall, and it's still being referred to at council meetings and committee meetings and just within different groups. Now, our narrative budget, we sought to have a mix of text and of visuals. So we have some quotes that appear in text boxes. We have lots of photos. We have some infographic style lists, as well as some narrative paragraphs. And third, and finally, our narrative budget helped us to visually share qualitative and quantitative data about Calvary in an accessible way that didn't feel like sharing qualitative and quantitative data. So imagine saying to most of your church people, well, let's talk about the qualitative, so measuring the quality, and the quantitative, measuring the quantity of our giving. Most of your eyes glazed over already. So imagine saying that to another church person. So half the people, they would glaze over with boredom, and then the other half would kind of go back and say, whoa, that's not how we talk about church. Church is not a business. We don't measure results like that. Now imagine saying to your people, let me tell you the story of what God is up to here. Did you know that 2/3 of our community has had leadership in worship this year? Because of your generosity, we built a fence for a family in town whose mother is blind and also in a wheelchair, and so now their 2 small children can play at home safely. Did you know that our quilters spent 1,500 hours assembling quilts, and that they go around the world, but they're also used in our nursing home after someone dies, and they make their walk of glory for the processional from the nursing home to the funeral home? Because of your generosity at Calvary, we helped a mother get out of an abusive relationship. We're Calvary Lutheran Church. We thank God, share Jesus, and help others. Are there any questions?
I might have missed this, but on the bottom chart of off the budget gifts, you have can you explain the cost to the general budget again?
Yes. Yep. So thinking of all of the gifts that come through Calvary, our office administrator and our bookkeeper is processing them and filing them, and then, letters of thanks are sent out to different members, or pastors are having these conversations and cultivating these gifts. So by making a donation to something that's not on our budget, it still impacts how our staff is spending the time or how our building is being used. And so those are just rough estimates. So they're over and under on some of them, but just helping people to think that a gift to Twigs, even though it's beyond our budget, it still impacts, staff time, staff resources.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I see a question over there.
Have you used this narrative for more than 1 year?
No.
No. Okay.
Nope. We entered into an intentional process with Adam from the Center for Stewardship and Learning, or Leadership, and the Lake Institute of Giving. And so we began this process called Cultivating Congregational Cultures of Generosity. And we wanted to become more intentional. How do you create this generous culture at a congregation? How can we share our story in a way that doesn't make people's eyes glaze over as they try to go line by line? And so we saw how the narrative budget was received really well at other congregations, and so this was our first attempt and something we will be doing again this fall.
Being the business person, I was wondering what the results of that was financially. If it increased your budget, if people were talking about it more, were more willing to, to donate?
In terms of like the financial impact, I'm not exactly sure, but I can say in terms of our ability to share our story and kind of know of the different things that are happening at Calvary, that we're a lot more intentional about talking about what God is up to and how our gifts are able to impact our ministries.
Thank you.
I'm wondering who you needed on your team to get the ball rolling with really breaking down the budget this way. Was it spearheaded by the council or specific members of council or pastors or?
Yep, so our senior pastor took a lot of initiative with this. And if you all know Pastor Phil Holton, you'll know he's a man of many words. And so he gave me a lot of words and like solid documents of text, and then I primarily kind of culled a lot of the data to make it visual. I was able to I did the layout and the graphics. There is a website that I use often called Canva, so it's like Canvas, but without the S, and this is such an easy way. They have pre-formatted designs, so pretty much every infographic and quote that you see is a free format that I just had to plug our text into on Canva, and there's a lot of other great free like infographic creating sources. Our council was also a big part of this. We asked them as they were creating their usual annual report to really think about some of the stories that can be within that document they were used to creating that we could also then put in a more succinct or more visual format in the narrative budget.
I just wanted to speak to this too. This is probably our 4th or 5th year of doing the narrative. Just to warn everybody too, we still have the duty people in our congregations that needed to see in a line item budget. So we had to be transparent that way. So to get back to the business side of things, that there were less of those line items taken. More people took the narrative budget, but many want to see the detail.
Yes, yep, so it's not a replacing of the old paradigm, but it's a realization that we have folks that are living in both worlds, so how can we communicate our message and our values to both people? Any other questions? The United Church of Canada has some really great resources on the narrative budget, so if you just Google United Church of Canada, in the back, the good-looking one in the back.
That's me.
That's my husband.
Can you speak a little bit to how the work that you did before you put this together and coming through this, how it has helped or changed the way you think about the dollars flowing in and out and the time spent?
Yeah, yep. I think when you're serving as staff or as a pastor, it can be really easy to get caught up in how are we going to keep our lights on, kind of what Anna and I were talking about before, that there's so many practical parts of ministry too. But the narrative budget and thinking of our ministry as the story, because our life is the story of what God is up to and how God has redeemed each of us. So focusing on a narrative budget helped us to shift away from are we going to have enough to meet our budget, to saying this is what God is up to and this is how your gift gifts and your generosity flow through Calvary and make a difference in Perham, in the Synod, in the world. Anything else? Well, thank you.